Hello and welcome to today's really fantastic event. We're discussing Clara Zetkin, socialist fighter against fascism, war, women's oppression, and again war. Uh, and today's forum, it's important to note, is co-hosted by socialist media site Labour Outlook and the events platform Arise, a festival of left ideas. And it's part of our ongoing online socialist ideas series. Sorry, my West Country accent came out there. Which has seen 10,000s of you tune in for discussions on topics as diverse as Marx, Engels, and Luxemburg's relevance today. That was three separate events there. The history of the struggle for Palestinian liberation, James Connolly's legacy, and much more besides. And today's discussion will focus on one of the most prominent revolutionaries of the early 20th century, Clara Zetkin. Zetkin was a leading German socialist thinker and organizer in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And she played a key role in the founding of International Women's Day, opposed World War I, and in the shadow of the rising Nazi power, bravely opened what would become the last session of the Reichstag, which is the German parliament, with a call to struggle in unity against fascism. As I'm sure all three of our speakers will go into much more detail. Clara Zetkin was one of the most brilliant minds ever drawn to our international socialist movement, an outstanding theorist and a political activist, which, the likes of which hopefully we will see again, but didn't see for quite some time. And this forum will look at the relevance of her ideas for transforming a world in crisis today, and how her work was broad in scope, tackling capitalism and socialism, war and peace, social struggles, class, gender, and much more. And in a time of permanent war, and it seems now permanent economic crisis, there is much we can learn from Clara and socialist ideas more generally. So I think taking part in these range of events and having you guys offering your questions and interacting with our speakers is really fantastic. So to discuss this today, we're joined by three speakers. So we have John Riddell, Kate Connelly, and Matthew Wilgress. John and Kate are both esteemed historians and socialist thinkers. Matt is national coordinator of the Arise, the Festival of Left Ideas, and again is quite a prominent socialist thinker. And just to go into a little bit more detail about them, just in case you hadn't heard of any of our speakers before, John Riddell is co-editor with Mike Tabor of the acclaimed collection Fighting Fascism, How to Struggle and How to Win by Clara Zetkin. He's been active in the socialist movement in Canada, the United States, and Europe since 1960. He's a world-renowned historian of world socialist movements. We were just discussing before we came live John's upcoming books, which I urge you all to keep an eye out from on Haymarket, so that you can keep yourself up to date with the latest from John. Kate Connelly is a writer and historian, and she led student strikes in the 2003 anti-war movement, and she latterly coordinated the Emily Wilding Davison Memorial Campaign in 2013. You may remember her from our Sylvia Pankhurst event, and she's quite a leading historian on Sylvia Pankhurst, with her writing Sylvia Pankhurst, Suffragette, Socialist, and Scourge of Empire, and edited Suffragette in America, Reflections on Prisoners, Pickets, and Political Change. As I say, Matt is national coordinator of the Arise Festival of Left Ideas, and involved in many more struggles as well, ranging from Palestine to Latin America. So we want to have as many questions and comments from the audience as possible. Because of the size of the audience today, with hundreds of you joining us, we have volunteers who are going to be facilitating this through the Q&A function. And so please post both your comments for discussion and your questions to the speakers in the Q&A function. Also, let us know where you're tuning in from. Tell us where you're coming in from. We always like to find out where people are coming from. We're going to have a time for a few rounds of questions from the audience after the speakers. So please start thinking of them now, really, before we get going. And if you can, you'll see some donate links, and as well as some links to different books and different campaigns that you might want to check out as we go. So I'm sure that's enough of me and enough of my voice for a little bit. So we're going to go to our speakers now for a presentation on Clara Zetkin. We're going to start off with John Riddell. So, as I say, John, we are very honoured to have you here today, and especially as you're going to be having to obviously sadly leave us halfway through. But your presence here is really, I'm really, really grateful, and I'm sure lots of us will really look forward to hearing from you. So, John, off you go.
Well, thank you, Logan. Thank you for your generous introduction and for the invitation to take part in this very important event in socialist activity in Britain. Now, I'm particularly pleased that you have chosen to speak on Clara Zetkin, who is such a central figure in the thought and strategy of socialism in a century ago. Now, Clara Zetkin's reputation at the time of the Russian Revolution was truly unique. She was the best known and most influential revolutionary leader outside Soviet Russia. Lenin himself had singled out Zetkin for her leadership role during the First World War, which Lenin termed one of having made a, quote, clear break with the capitalist rulers' support for the slaughter. It was only after consultation with Zetkin that Karl Liebknecht took his historic stand in the German parliament against funding Germany's war effort. Lenin singled out Zetkin, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, and Franz Mehring as among the most prominent figures resisting the war. Yet of these internationally known revolutionaries, only Zetkin lived past January 1919. She thus became the most renowned revolutionary leader outside Soviet Russia. In 1921, the 2-year-old Communist International, called the Comintern for short, fell into a crisis of ultra-leftism. Now, ultra-leftism, that's the delusion that an initiative by a bold minority could by itself bring down capitalist rule. For a time, this outlook influenced many of the Communist International's foremost leaders, both in Soviet Russia and abroad. Zetkin led the way in opposing these ultra-left errors, allying with Lenin to correct the course of the International. In 1923, the Comintern fell into a crisis as a result of bureaucratic degeneration, both in the Russian Soviet Republic and in communist parties abroad. The International retreated from its commitment to forge workers' unity against capitalism and to struggle for a workers' and peasants' government. During these years, as Joseph Stalin took the helm of the International, Zetkin fell silent. Zetkin was still honored in the International, but now her views were no longer heard. While praising the Soviet Union's achievements, Zetkin did not join in the customary adulation of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader. Zetkin expressed her contempt for Stalin in a private note intended for the Soviet leader Nikolai Bukharin in Moscow. In 1929, the Russian émigré and social democratic press published rumors that Zetkin was being persecuted by communist authorities in Moscow. The German communists' central newspaper, Die Rote Fahne, broke its silence regarding Clara Zetkin by publishing her denials of these reports. The second of these statements by Zetkin ended in a fashion surely disconcerting to the friends of Stalin who were publishing her remarks. Quote, "As is generally known, my outlook on both tactics and fundamentals, Zetkin stated, stands opposed to the opinion of the majority of the Comintern executive. Aware of the Comintern's degeneration, Zetkin maneuvered cautiously and skillfully to maintain her status as a tolerated dissident. In a 1929 memorandum to friends, she pledged, "I will break party discipline 3 times, 4 times, if it serves the interests of the revolution." When Stalin in 1931 assailed the memory of Rosa Luxemburg, Zetkin's longtime friend and comrade, Zetkin attacked this insult to Luxemburg's memory. But Zetkin's protest circulated only in private letters. "My greatest affliction to the proletarian revolution. Should I speak out, or should I remain silent?" She paid the price of maintaining membership in a communist party controlled by Stalin, the price of saying only a fraction of what she believed. Clara Zetkin continued to present publicly as long as possible aspects of her long-standing proposal for a united front against fascism. For example, in greeting the Communist Party's 1931 campaign for freedom of choice in abortion, Zetkin made a public appeal for unity with women in the Social Democratic Party of Germany. In August 1932, Zetkin seized the chance to speak publicly to a national audience on the need for united action against fascism. United action against fascism. She had to leave out some important things, such as calling for socialists to challenge the Social Democrats to join in a united front. Passages from Clara Zetkin's text were removed by her party's pro-Stalin leadership, nonetheless confident that she could express the essence of her thinking. Zetkin eagerly grasped the opportunity. The circumstances of Zetkin's speech were dramatic. The global depression that had broken out in 1929 had hit Germany hard. Workers' parties were consumed by fratricidal struggle. Hitler's National Socialists quickly grew to be Germany's largest party. The Nazi vote rose from 2% in 1928 to 37% only 4 years later. In the July 1932 vote, Zetkin was re-elected to Parliament, to which she had belonged since 1920. 74 years old, she was the oldest member of Parliament and as such had the right to formally open its first session. The Nazi press bristled with vile threats against her as a communist Jew, as a slut, as a traitor. The Communist Party of Germany received a Nazi threat to assault her on the floor of Parliament. But when Zetkin's party's Central Committee asked whether she could open the Reichstag session, Zetkin responded with characteristic defiance, "I'll get there dead or alive." Driven incognito into Berlin, she slipped into a safe house. Her biographer, Gilbert Badia, describes the ensuing drama in Parliament. Clara Zetkin was very weak, subject to fainting fits, and almost blind. on August 30, before a parliament crammed with Nazi deputies in uniforms, 2 communist deputies helped the old woman to mount the speaker's platform. She spoke at first with a barely audible voice, but little by little her voice strengthened and grew passionate. The final part of her talk reasserted her long-standing call for international unity against fascism. Here is what she said, and I quote, "Our most urgent task today is to form a united front of all working people in order to turn back fascism. All the differences that divide us and shackle us, whether founded on political, trade union, religious, or ideological outlooks, must give way before this imperious historical necessity. All those who are menaced, all those who suffer, all those who desire freedom must join the united front against fascism and its representatives in government. Working people must assert themselves against fascism. That is the urgent and indispensable precondition for a united front. A united front against economic crisis, against imperialist war and its causes, and against the capitalist mode of production." And Zetkin continued, "The revolt of millions of laboring men and women in Germany against hunger, deprivation, fascist murder, and imperialist war expresses the imperishable destiny of producers the world over. This destiny, shared among us around the world, must find expression through forging an iron community of struggle of all working people in every sphere ruled by capitalism. We must also unite them with their vanguard, the liberated brothers and sisters in the Soviet Union. Strikes and uprisings in various countries abroad are blazing fires showing those in struggle in Germany that they are not alone. Everywhere, the disinherited and the defeated are beginning to advance toward taking power. Millions of women in Germany are still subjected to the chains of sexual slavery and thereby also to the most oppressive form of class slavery. These women must not be absent from the united front of working people now taking shape in Germany. The youth who want to blossom and mature must fight in the very front ranks. Today, their only prospect is that the corpse-like military obedience and exploitation in the ranks of obligatory labor service. All those who produce through intellectual labor, whose skill generates social well-being and culture, can find no expression in the existing bourgeois order. They too belong in the united front, Zetkin said. The united front must embrace all those who are dependent on wages or salaries or otherwise must pay tribute to capitalism, for it is they who both sustain capitalism and are its victims. I am opening this session of Parliament, Clara Zetkin said, in fulfillment of my duty as honorary chair and in the hope that despite my present infirmity, I may yet have the good fortune to open as honorary chair the first Congress of the Workers' Councils of a Soviet Germany. Zetkin's courageous call for a united front against fascism, made in Germany's parliament less than a year before her death, stands as a fitting summary of her lifetime of struggle for the goal of socialism, not barbarism. Zetkin's spirit lives today in all the world's struggles for peace and justice. Zetkin's call for socialism, not barbarism, lives on and is exemplified today, above all, in the freedom struggle in Palestine and the Middle East. And so with that, I thank you for this invitation, and let us go on to our discussion.
Thank you so much, John. That was inspiring, and it was really fantastic. And I'm sure from the whole of the meeting, I'll want to wish you well for your appointment, and hopefully we'll get to hear a little bit of Kate's before we have to go. Before we do that, though, I just want to say that we have over 100 people joining us from places including Bristol, Croydon, Derby, Somerset, Haringey, Islington, Catford, Northampton, and it's also great to be joined uh, by our friend, and I'm sure John's as well, Paul LeBlanc from Pittsburgh in the USA. So it's fantastic to have you all on with us. And before we hear from Kate, we're just going to very quickly go to one of our volunteers, Sean, who's going to tell you a little bit more about how you can help support the work of Labour Outlook and Arise.
Thank you ever so much, Logan, and thank you so much for that introduction tonight, John. As Logan said at the start of this meeting, this is part of the Socialist Ideas series that we've been doing. So previous meetings have included Socialism or Barbarism, Why Rosa Luxemburg Matters Today, and the bloody history of UK and US imperialism in Palestine and the Middle East. And you can watch those and all the other events or listen to them while you're cooking or going on your run or a nice walk or something on our YouTube channel, which volunteers are putting links in the chat to. And the aim of the series is really to give a space for us to learn a bit more about our collective history, to reflect on it, and also take inspiration from those that have gone before us when we're shaping our action and taking our action in the different struggles that we face today. Our events are free and they're done by volunteers, and we want to keep it that way. But each event we put on does cost hundreds of pounds, just because we're not in a physical room. The sort of digital infrastructure to provide these events isn't free, unfortunately. So we know things are really tough at the moment, but we would ask those of you that can afford to give a solidarity donation of £20 or whatever you can afford, so that we can keep putting on these events and arranging them, but also to keep them free for everyone in the future. So thank you very much. And I hope that everyone else is also looking forward to hearing Kate and Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And with not much time else for a break, I would like to invite Kate Connelly. As I say, Kate's esteemed historian and socialist thinker in Britain, so it'd be really great to hear Kate's opinion and what we can learn from Zetkin going forward. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Logan. That was a very generous introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's a real honour to speak with John, and who's done so much research and published so much to advance our understanding of of many things, but of this particular period of history, no less. And thank you, John, for that very inspiring and very moving account of Zetkin and her contribution and her courage. I'm going to talk. I'm going to start with International Women's Day, and I want to think a little bit about the kind of mainstream coverage, the main ways that we tend to encounter International Women's Day today, which seems to be drained of any political meaning. It's something that is widely celebrated by the corporate world. Every bank, corporation, supermarket, everything, manages to get its IWD hashtag out. This year, Number 10 Downing Street held a celebration of International Women's Day with so-called inspirational female leaders, at which Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, said that he was going to back female-led businesses. None of these events or these once-in-a-year photo opportunities are run by working-class women. None of them are opportunities to talk about the kind of world that we want to live in. They are self-congratulatory reflections of society as it is. And yet, International Women's Day was established precisely to strengthen working class women's struggles to overthrow the status quo. Its founder, Clara Zetkin, who we're talking about today, and that history of International Women's Day, that radical history of the day, is kept very far away from the corporate hashtags, because that history runs directly counter to it. And what I want to argue is that Clara Zetkin and the radical history of International Women's Day are more relevant to the problems that women face today. Clara Zetkin was part of a generation of socialists who knew Friedrich Engels in the last years of his life. Engels, of course, lived most of his life in exile. He was a lifelong revolutionary, the closest collaborator with Karl Marx, and together with Marx, most famously, they co-authored the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Engels was always interested in questions about women's oppression, but Marx and Engels became particularly interested in this question towards the end of their lives. In fact, Marx was researching for a book on precisely that subject when he died, which Engels published from his notes and developed in 1885 into The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. So Clara Zetkin connected Engels and that tradition of Marx and Engels to the questions faced by socialists at the beginning of the 20th century. And she also, as John was saying, championed the ideas of one of the most important and talented of a younger generation of Marxists, Rosa Luxemburg, who was murdered by the proto-fascist Freikorps in 1919. So Zetkin was somebody who connected socialists across the generations and somebody who carried the lessons of revolutionary socialist thought for almost over a century. Zetkin worked very closely with Rosa Luxemburg, and together the two of them defended the revolutionary core of Engels and Marx's socialism against attempts to reject that and to jettison that essential revolutionary core of those ideas by the leaders, or many of the leaders of the German left party, the SPD. The SPD was a very significant political force in Germany. It was outlawed actually the year that Zetkin joined the organization, and she had to live as a mother of young children in exile for 10 years. So the SPD was outlawed between 1878 and 1890, had to operate in quite a clandestine register. And once it was able to operate legally, it became a very, very significant force in German politics. It had a whole kind of cultural life associated with it, a huge amount of clubs and publications and all of these kind of things. Was, much more than maybe we might think of many kind of political parties today. By 1912, it was the biggest party in the Reichstag, in the German parliament. So had 110 representatives, and this meant that socialists all across Europe looked up to the SPD because of the size of it. This meant that the leaders of the SPD were very widely consulted. They also had known Engels as well, and they were regarded, as very, very influential people. You compare what was going on in Germany with what was going on in England at the time. The Labour Party, for example, had quite a small percentage of seats in Parliament, at 42 seats. The SPD was the organisation that people looked to and was very, very influential. And many of the leaders of the SPD, particularly those grouped around Edward Bernstein, for example, they argued, they were trying to assess what had changed, which we must do, since the period when people like Marx and Engels were writing in the middle of the 19th century. And one of the things that they began to conclude was that the contradictions of capitalism that Marx was writing about, and which in which he saw the hope of a revolutionary transformation of society. Many of the leading theorists in the SPD were arguing very differently, and they were saying that by the beginning of the 20th century, developments that have taken place meant that these contradictions might be transcended by different factors other than revolutionary change. It might be that the interdependence, for example, of European states might mean that war becomes a thing of the past, and that instead of revolutionary action, it might be possible to achieve change through parliamentary action. Now, Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg absolutely opposed this kind of revisionism. They did not see the nation state as a neutral body that you could just go in and change at will. And what they saw was that the development of capitalism in Europe, spreading very, very rapidly, and indeed the very aggressive imperialist expansion, which Germany had joined in since becoming a nation state, involving itself in the scramble for Africa and so on and so forth, were reflections of a sharpening and a deepening of those contradictions of capitalism, not in any way of those being weakened. And what they argued was that this was going to lead to more profound outbreaks of violence and lead to more serious and devastating wars. And of course, they were proved right in 1914 with the outbreak of the First World War, something that Zetkin, in a letter to anti-war women in Britain, she described as the most awful crime which capitalism created. At the same time, the subordination of the idea of revolutionary struggle to the idea of working was worked out by the SPD leadership, who didn't take a stand against the war. Quite the opposite. They voted for war credits so that the German state could participate in the First World War. And I say this because I think this is important context to understand and appreciate Zetkin's approach to the specific question of women's rights, because she always insisted that these shouldn't be approached ahistorically or abstractly. What Zetkin was arguing was that the problems faced by women were products of the very same historical development, of the same class struggle, of the same capitalist society that affected all of the other questions with which socialists were concerned, and that it was an inconsistent idealism to treat these as somehow kind of separate. So I want to talk about what that means, what that meant in practice for Clara Zetkin. So as I said, she was working in a very difficult environment. For part of the time, socialist activity was illegal. But also in most of Germany, up until 1908, it was actually illegal for women to join political organizations. Now, at the time that she was politically active, there were many campaigns run by women's organizations to allow women to participate in political action, to campaign for things like the right to vote, abortion rights, and things like that. And the leadership of the SPD, which Zetkin was a member, Zetkin was a member of the SPD, so was Rosa Luxemburg, urged support for these and to back these and to throw their effort into them because these were progressive campaigns. Zetkin's approach was rather different. She asked, what was the political content of those campaigns and whose interests did they serve? And she asked this because she understood that the development of capitalist society affected different women differently. That for elite women, the development of capitalist society this led to the rise of an ideology sometimes called separate spheres. This idea, one we're quite familiar with, the idea that elite women were very delicate flowers who belonged solely in the private sphere. The home was the place they should be confined to, that they should have no role in public life at all. And therefore, they were fighting against men of their own class who were excluding them from the professions, from higher education, from any ability to participate in that public life. Zetkin described it as a free competition between the two of them. Women were blocked from that. But that was very different for working class women. For working class women, the development of capitalist society had meant the destruction of old modes of production, particularly the kind of cottage industries under the kind of patriarchal control of the family. Now, when goods were being produced, what Marx described as the means of production, the machinery, all of those kind of things, those weren't owned by individual workers in their own homes. Those were increasingly owned by the big, wealthy capitalists who owned the factories, who owned the machineries. And working class people, whether men or women, were forced to go and sell their ability to labor. So for working class women, they were absolutely pitted into free competition with men of their own class. Except that the oppression of women also meant that capitalist employers could justify paying women even less. So it led to the increased and intensified exploitation of women. Now, what Zetkin said about this, she said this in a speech she later published in 1896. She called it only in conjunction with the proletarian woman will socialism be victorious. This is her conclusion from this different historical development for working class women. Therefore, the liberation struggle of the proletarian woman cannot be similar to the struggle that the bourgeois, the capitalists, women of the capitalist class, the bourgeois woman wages against the men of her class. On the contrary, for working class women, it must be a joint struggle with the male of her class against the entire class of capitalists. Her final aim is not the free competition with the man, but the achievement of the political rule of the proletariat. And so therefore, for Zetkin, the kind of separate organizing that many of the elite women were engaged in didn't make sense for working class women. They shared an interest, in other words, in fighting with men of their own class to overthrow capitalist society and to achieve universal human emancipation. And so whilst it was that Zetkin absolutely right, she said that elite women were completely justified in campaigning for access to public life, for access to higher education, all of these things. She also believed that they weren't going to lead to the emancipation of working class women. And that for all the radicalism of that language, that was not going to translate into universal emancipation. She said this in the same text: "We must not let ourselves be fooled by socialist trends in the bourgeois women's movement, which lasts only as long as bourgeois women feel oppressed." Essentially, that when the narrow gains fought for by elite women become achieved, then for them the struggle is over, and that's something that they abandon. I think it's a very prescient observation about many of the things that we see today, the commercialization, the co-option of International Women's Day being purely about questions of glass ceilings and not about the experiences of the vast majority of women. But it was also very prescient about many of the women's organizations, the feminist organizations in Zetkin's own time. Gertrude Bäumer, for example, one of the leaders of the BDF, which was one of these kind of feminist organizations. This was an organization that was completely supportive of German imperialism, and very much kind of wedded to that project. If you think about some of the other struggles that Zetkin commented on, she particularly commented on the struggles for women's suffrage, which was so important at the beginning of the 20th century. In Britain, the largest militant suffrage organization, the Women's Social and Political Union, was in 1914 involved in bombing churches. It appeared on the surface to be a very radical organization. With the outbreak of the First World War, they suspended their activities, they ceased fighting for women's rights, and they supported the war efforts. And so while Zetkin was arguing that socialists shouldn't just endorse anything on the basis of, what was people were saying, oh, we're doing this on behalf of women, the other side of that also was an insistence that socialists had to take very, very seriously the involvement of working class women in struggle. And it was this to which she dedicated so much of her life's work. She edited for 25 years a fortnightly journal for women in the SPD called Gleichheit, so equality. She fought very hard to get women organized into trade unions and to part of the organized labor struggle. And of course, she was instrumental in creating international conferences of socialist women, so to connect women up across national boundaries. And it was at these conferences that she very much argued that socialist women should not be endorsing struggles for the suffrage that were just going to enfranchise a very small group of women. Instead, she really insisted that what socialists had to be doing was supporting something called adult suffrage at the time, which meant votes for all women and votes for all men, the poorest men in society. It was at one of these international conferences, of course, the one in Copenhagen in 1910, that she launched the idea of International Women's Day. And International Women's Day, as it was conceived at these conferences, reflected the socialist politics of Clara Zetkin. When it was initially proposed, it wasn't initially proposed for the 8th of March. That got moved in 1913 to that date. When it was first envisaged and proposed by German women, they proposed it for the 18th of March because that was the day that the Paris Commune was founded. So this was something that took place in 1871, when for 72 days, working class people, men and women, ran the city of Paris. It, in 72 days, under a state of siege, managed to achieve a level of reform that is unimaginable, really, in the society in which we live. Old ideas about the position of women in society were completely torn up. Old ideas about the status of the working class completely transformed, a workers' government, all of these kind of things. This was a project that was strangled both by the newly founded German state and by the French ruling class. So for German women to propose that International Women's Day begin on that day in tribute to the communards was a statement against German militarism and the German state. And so International Women's Day in the years that followed became a very important symbol of resistance to war. When women celebrated International Women's Day during the First World War, that was also a resistance against war. And of course, that is the context in which the most important International Women's Day unfolded. And that was the International Women's Day of 1917 in Russia. That was the day that women chose to come out onto the streets and very bravely protest against the most autocratic regime in Europe, against the Tsar. It was that day that gave them that courage. And it was that day that began the February Revolution in Russia, leading to these huge changes, the legacy of which John was speaking about earlier. So the real legacy of International Women's Day this year was not at Downing Street, where the Prime Minister is backing a genocide, the overwhelming victims of which have been women and children. It was in this country, it was on the demonstration, the International Women's Day demonstration in solidarity with Gaza. The real spirit of International Women's Day is not to make corporations look good. The real spirit of International Women's Day is carried by the women who are struggling precisely against those corporations and the system under which we live, which sees such gross levels of inequality, war, and oppression. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for that, as ever, fantastic overview there of Clara's work. And just going to go to our last speaker before we take a round of questions, and maybe even two if we have time. Probably not, probably just one. We're going to hear from Matt Wilgress, National Coordinator of Arise, a festival of left ideas. Matt.
Thank you, Logan, and thank you for the invitation to speak at sort of last minute invitation in case John had to leave before the questions. Most of what I was going to cover has been covered by the two speakers, which is good because it means I won't go on for too long. But I was just going to add a personal short reflection, which was I was actually on holiday last week in Berlin and went on a hunt in the big Tiergarten Park in the centre to find the memorials to Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, which obviously Kate meant, who were killed during the German Revolution, and then thrown into the river in Rosa's body. And we found them, and they'd been put up in the 80s, but they weren't very prominent in a lot of the official guides and so on to the area. So whilst they were kept well and findable, it did make me wonder about how collective memory on these sort of things continues and how it can be renewed. And this brings me to my point of my short contribution, really, which is sometimes when we put on these kind of events, these more historical looking, I suppose, socialist ideas events, as opposed to alleys about the current crises or things that are going on. Some people do email in saying, why are you doing that? You know, we need action. What's this got to do with this price for loaf of bread kind of attitude, to paraphrase? Actually, I think what comes out in them, and it came out in the Rosa Luxemburg and the Connelly ones, and I think it's come out today in both the contributions, is that actually we can learn from this issue and make it relevant to what's going on in the world today and what the struggles we're in today against war, against racism and all forms of oppression. They haven't, and against the far right, of course, haven't started now. And actually, in terms of, for example, just to use the example of the far right, if we look at the crisis we face and we look at the polarization taking place in a lot of places in the world, you know, Argentina has a far right president, but Brazil had a far right president, was defeated. The continuing polarization in the States and amazing almost survival of Trump. There, just to give a few examples, but also the sort of insane rise of the kind of alt-right voices here, which now dominate large chunks of the so-called mainstream media narrative and parliamentary narrative, on their ideas that try to divide people on certain issues, if not in their elected numbers here. Actually going back, I think, and looking at how people such as Zetkin and Gramsci and others understood fascism isn't just a historical question. Something that's quite relevant for us in this time of crisis, as Logan said. And if you look at the world today, I think you've got crisis in a lot of places. You've got scapegoating of Black communities, migrants, as we see here with the Rwanda scheme, trans people, as we see in the media every day. And their scapegoating aren't exactly the kind of things that far right and fascist movements will play on and be part of. So actually looking back at how some people seek to understand the rise of fascism initially, which people had the most interesting and correct understanding of it, but also put forward tactics in a concrete way, as John was talking about the United Front, what it means to counter that is something that is actually more and more relevant to this world we're in. And I think in terms of Britain, when a Starmer government comes in and the social crisis deepens, the risk of a far right growth under a do-nothing Starmer government, or more accurately, do bad things Starmer government, will be very real. So I actually think these discussions that we're having are still relevant today. And we will need people, you know, active now to defend our trade unions, to fight against racism, to defend against police getting out of control, to support women's rights, trans liberation, support the increasing movements that were needed against attacks on our civil liberties, and of course stand with immigrants. So actually learning about the United Front, learning about these historical things isn't just an abstract question. It's something that we can look and grow and learn our own understanding, which will help inform our own practice. So I think actually studying the nature of the far right fascism and the history of struggle against it, studying the nature of what International Women's Day originally meant and its anti-war message, which couldn't be more important in the world today, I actually think will come into its own a bit, whereas we see growing numbers of younger people in particular directly talking about how we fight for a socialist future, people and planet before corporate greed. So in that sense, I think this forum and the other ones in the Socialist Ideas session are really important. So I think it's been great to have the two speakers with us and great to learn about these ideas. And the United Front, just to close on this, of course, is also an idea that we can adapt and use for a whole series of campaigns that we're involved in, from solidarity with the people of Palestine to ending the proliferation of nuclear weapons and much more besides. So I think it's been a great discussion, and thanks everyone for participating.
Thank you, Matt, for that brief overview and raising that important point of why we need to keep learning and listening to others as we go. So we've got some questions come in. We've had quite a few. I've got them all written down. The first of all is one for you, Kate. I'll do 3 at a time, but this one is sort of aimed more probably towards you than our other two speakers. And it comes from Facebook, and it says that women are most affected by war, as we see by the assault on Gaza today. And Zetkin, obviously, as you said, was a fighter against World War One. How can we put the cause of peace back into the politics of International Women's Day and the women's liberation movement more generally? Our second two, which both John is luckily still with us, so we can have some interactions with John as well, and with Matt. We have one from Ben from Islington, who asks, which contemporary struggles do the speakers think Zetkin's writings and actions be especially useful for understanding and for plotting out what we can do as socialists? And then sort of tied into that, we have one from Fraser from Derby, which asks what role can different parts of the left here, and obviously John in Canada as well, in and out of Labour or the NDP in Canada, play in relation to a united front, as we see the growth of the right in the UK and across Europe, and as Matt said, across the Americas, and that drive globally towards permanent austerity and permanent war. So, Kate, if I go to you first, if you want to answer one of those, all 3 of them, what have you, I'll then do John and Matt as well. Okay.
Thank you. It's a really great question. I'll just deal with the question particularly directed to me about women and war. And I mean, I think the fact that we've been demonstrating, pretty much fortnightly in protest at what's happening and what Israel's doing to Gaza in London. And I think it was really important that around International Women's Day, that demonstration for Gaza linked International Women's Day to the Palestine movement, and that I think was very, very powerful. There was a all-woman platform, and that was really important in raising the profile of that demonstration, and I think that was a really good example of solidarity. Just in terms of some of the other things about that, when we think today that there isn't exactly a strong women's movement in the way that we can think of examples from the past, but that doesn't mean there aren't many women who are politically active and politically involved. If we think about the trade union movement, for example, that is the majority of trade unionists today are women, and one of the things that I think we have to do is to be raising the question of Palestine at work. and to be, using our collective strength that we have in these organizations to be able to build a strong and enduring and deepening solidarity movement. So I think that's going to be a really important priority for us. And I also think that the existence of anti-war campaigning is so important in terms of defending women's rights, because we've seen this time and again. It was mentioned at the beginning of the meeting that really the sort of first campaigns that I was involved in were the sort of first big campaigns was against the war on terror, was involved in the Stop the War movement. And that was so important in challenging the kind of the imperialist feminism, the co-option of feminism, the weaponizing of it to justify war that was done, by the establishment, by Laura Bush, by Sherry Blair, with these kind of racist ideas that they perpetuated about we need to go and invade other countries, and one of the most important antidotes to that was a mass movement with Muslim women right at the heart of it, challenging those arguments, and talking about what real liberation looks like and where real liberation comes from. And so I think the anti-war movement actually has a huge part to play in that as well. I think it's very much a two-way process, that these struggles strengthen one another.
Fantastic. John, would you want to contribute maybe on the contemporary struggles and the different roles of the left, both in and out of maybe, I guess, sort of mainstream social democratic parties to the United Front?
Well, the most important thing is that the political landscape in Canada has been transformed by solidarity with Palestine. This came quite suddenly, just over the last few months, and has cut across society as a whole, drawing in forces from the labor movement, from youth, from women. My companion, Suzanne, for example, gave a talk on Palestine, which was picked up in 5 different continents. Indicating great interest going on in this. It's a new situation which we're only struggling to comprehend, and which is going to be a continuing factor over the next few years. Now, it's in this context that the discussion we're having today is a particular help in orienting us to face this new reality. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Matt, very briefly, and then I've got
I agree with what John was saying there, and Kate. Just a couple of very quick things I'd add. One on the Labour question and people in and out of Labour. I don't think we're going to get in a situation where none of the left in Britain is in the Labour Party, or all of it is. Like, that hasn't been the case in the whole 25 years I've been involved. And I think sometimes people need to get a bit less hung up about this on both sides. I've seen sectarianism both ways, and I don't think we need it. And I think when Starmer's on the right defensive, but also these awful things are going on, we can learn to work together more cooperatively. And I think one of the best things about Arise has been that we've been able to bring in people from such different currents and traditions for these discussions, and current ones, and amplify struggles. I agree with John on the Palestine point. It's very similar here. I think it's transforming the situation. It's a mass movement, but also it's a sort of movement of permanent mobilization, which we certainly haven't seen for over 20 years here. And I think it's also interesting that it's on the issue of Palestine. It isn't on the issue of austerity, which a lot of people, I think, formulaically, I find it hard to say that word, on the left predicted it would be. It isn't me saying we shouldn't struggle against austerity, but we should recognise the significance of this. I also think something Kate mentioned about the continuing of the anti-war movement in more difficult times and so on is important. And I think those something that we do have here that we shouldn't take for granted and we should defend is we do have things like Stand Up to Racism, Stop the War Coalition, various Latin America campaigns, including Cuba Solidarity Campaign, CND, things that have been going for decades and have a mass base, including organisational support within the labour movement and have radical leadership. And I think that's something that we shouldn't take for granted because it can easily be taken away, divided or broken up. So maintaining those sort of united fronts on those issues and building broader and enlarged ones on new issues as they spark up and around older issues as they come back. But we shouldn't take those things for granted. We should appreciate that we have them and work together to support and defend them.
Fantastic. If it's okay with speakers, we have a few more questions, so we might overrun a little bit, but I think these questions are only going to deepen our understanding of Zetkin. So we've got one from Joe on Zoom, which primarily is for John, but if others feel they want to speak on it, they can as well. Which says, John spoke about Zetkin's opposition to Stalin. How isolated was she in the KPD, and what was her position on the increasing centralization of power in the Soviet Communist Party? Did she oppose then the KPD, who wanted to isolate the Social Democrats and block the formation of a united front? So I guess that's a sort of third period class against class question there. We have a good one from Kevin and Pip on Zoom, who asked, how active and with whom was Clara Zetkin active in 1914? Maybe like Emily Hobhouse, for example, and did they know each other in preventing World War I, stopping it once it started? And the final question for the day from Carol. Today, more women are having their collective consciousness raised in the present climate. How can we encourage women of all ages to become involved in learning about our socialist her story so that we become empowered going forwards? Shall I do it in the opposite order? So let's go Matt, then John, then Kate. Matt.
Yeah, very quickly. There's also a question from David that I've wanted to answer, which David from Durham asked, do you think some of the attitudes from 1930s Europe and Britain are returning now to Europe and Britain? Yes, is my short answer to that, David. But I think it does, if you look in, it does relate to what we're having, the discussion we're having about the rise of the far right. And not all the formations that we describe as far right or alt-right are fascist in the classical sense. Some of them are. In Berlin, as I was saying where I was last week, there's a big rise of the far right. You can see it in terms of street stickers. You can see it in terms of even selling post sort of papers that were obviously far right. Just from even my bad German, I could work that out. Well, I think those attitudes are returning, but I don't think we should underestimate how many people want to fight those attitudes as well. Like the Black Lives Matter movement here blossomed out of nowhere and was massive. When you see the authoritarianism the government adapting to the alt-right, things like Kill the Bill and the movements around police violence against women and police violence against black communities have been very significant. So I don't think we should be pessimistic, and I think we should also ideologically take on these attitudes as well as in terms of direct action and united front. I don't think any of the other ones necessarily need my answer. Just to say, Lenin, we've got on the call Paul LeBlanc from Pittsburgh, as Logan mentioned, and it's great to have Paul with us again. But just Logan mentioned this, but something to be prepared for is our Lenin 100 series of events, which some people involved with this and other currents are putting together. The first one of them will be with Paul LeBlanc on Lenin and the struggle for a socialist future today. Obviously, it's a centenary of Lenin's death, so please do follow the link that's in the chat and get involved with that. And thank you again to John, Logan, and
John?
You know, it struck me this mention of a movement that you experienced that blossomed out of nowhere. And it reminded me of something that happened here in Ontario, where I live, about 6 months ago. Is that the teachers were threatening to go out on strike in a wage dispute. And the government stepped forward and banned their strike. And the union movement was so shocked by this unexpected brutality of the government's action that this union movement, which is not particularly radical and whose leaders are not particularly progressive, called a general strike, an unlimited general strike. And the government was totally shocked by this and capitulated. And so life went on, but not as before, because that's now part of our collective experience. So I thought that underlined the need to be ready for the unexpected. After that experience we had about a wage struggle, then in the teacher sector, the next thing that happened was, guess what? Palestine. What they got to do with each other? Except the most important thing, that both these movements express the impatience and the depth of anger among working people in this place where I live. So I just let it go with that for me. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And finally, Kate.
Thank you. Yeah, I suppose I want to say, I want to respond to two things. There was a question about learning about our history, and I think that there are moments when we move into struggle when it poses very kind of sharply for us these questions about, have these problems, have these issues been encountered before? And I think that's why it's so important to have events like this and to talk about socialist history and socialist theory, because it arms us. It means that, you know, we know in advance what that collected experience is, what kind of how we can best respond to these challenges that we face. They don't come out of nowhere. So I think, you know, kind of stressing that, and I think it's happened a lot in this meeting, and I'm not surprised to hear that people are saying that, you know, these are questions that have happened before. What can we learn from the past? And sort of related to that, I want to come back on the question asked by was Kevin about other people that Zetkin was active with in 1914. Because actually, you know, it was quite a small group of people when the leadership of the SPD voted to back the war. You know, its biggest left party in Europe. When Lenin, you know, the Bolshevik leader in exile, read this, he thought it was Tsarist propaganda. It just couldn't be true. But reality was actually that depressing. This meant that people like Zetkin and Luxemburg then had to organize with others to try and create an anti-war current. You know, I think one of the lessons from that is that, you know, they needed to have, it would have strengthened them had they kind of had that organization before the catastrophe of 1914. They knew theoretically what the problems of that approach, the kind of theoretical approach being pushed at the top of the SPD were. And they then had to develop an organization in very, very difficult circumstances. So, you know, initially that was a very small group. They were, you know, very much persecuted. Rosa Luxemburg went to prison. Zetkin was arrested many times. So it was the two of them. Of course, they were in close contact with Lenin, who again was one of the socialist leaders who was anti-war right from the start. Karl Liebknecht, Franz Mehring in Germany. So it was this sort of quite small group, and by doing that, though, they provided an inspiration and a pole of attraction for other anti-war socialists across Europe, who were very often facing exactly the same problems as the German socialists in their own countries. And I was looking up before this meeting, because I write on Sylvia Pankhurst, so I was looking up what Pankhurst said about Zetkin before this. So Sylvia Pankhurst was an anti-war socialist in Britain, who took a much more kind of left-wing position on the question of suffrage to the rest of the organization and her family. and she knew Clara Zetkin. And this is one of the things I found. I didn't know if I'd have the opportunity to read it, but in response to this question, I think I can. She established a campaign called Hands Off Russia, basically to try and win industrial solidarity, a refusal from workers to arm the attacks on Bolshevik Russia. And they held a national conference in Britain. And at their national conference, they decided that they wanted to elect as their honorary president Lenin, and as their vice presidents Karl Liebknecht, somebody they called Leo Trotsky, and Clara Zetkin. Now, they also added that owing to bad postal and telegraphic arrangements, it will be doubtful whether we shall get their consent before their next meeting. So we propose taking it for granted, which is quite sweet. But also, I think it tells you that for those that were trying to organize against imperialism and against war, it was people like that. It was Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, Clara Zetkin, Vladimir Lenin, that really provided that clarity and that inspiration to socialists around the world, and that's why we should continue to learn and draw inspiration from them.
I think I couldn't pick a better quote there to end it there, Kate. I think that was fantastic. So I just want to take the time just before I say goodbye to thank all of our speakers today. I think for speaking for me personally, that was fantastic. We had so many questions. I'm sorry to those we didn't quite get to. I'm sure if there'll be other meetings in the future, maybe where those questions can be asked and what have you. As Matt said, check out the links in the chat as well for some of the campaigns and other things that are coming up. And yeah, I think that was inspiring. So let's go out, let's win a better world, not just for the future, but for the here and now. So thank you, everybody, and hope you have a lovely rest of your evening.